Hi everyone, welcome to the CUNY New York State Initiative on Emergent Bilinguals webinar called Translanguaging in Dual Language Bilingual Education, Creating Transformation Spaces. We're excited to have all of you joining us today. My name is Sarah Vogel. I am a research assistant here at the Graduate Center. Now we're going to get started with theoretical foundations on understanding translanguaging in dual language bilingual education with our panelists. There'll be time for Q&A. And then you're going to get deeper into Gladys Aponte's dual language bilingual classroom, and we're going to talk through the examples that you've seen, and then end with some additional Q&A. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Maite Sánchez, who's CUNY-NYSIEB's Project Director, and then Gladys Aponte, who is the dual language bilingual teacher in the New York City Department of Education.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CUNY-NYSIEB webinar, and I'm excited to have here with me Gladys Aponte. For this webinar, hopefully you have seen the videos that were in our webpage, Gladys videos, and what you've seen these videos, and we're going to go through these videos during the webinar, later in the webinar. But this lesson didn't happen during the English time or the Spanish time in Gladys' classroom. This was an example of a purposely planned activity that was truly bilingual. So this type of lessons are not seen in most dual language classrooms.
Yeah, so I hope you had a chance to watch the videos. If not, they will be in the archives, and you will be able to visit the webpage in the future. And if you did get a chance to see it, we hope that this presentation answers some questions that you have and help you understand the reason I plan these type of spaces in my classroom. And I will show you more examples of transformation spaces in my classroom.
Great. So the example that you saw from Gladys is not what you typically will see in most dual language bilingual programs. So for example, you will see, and there are different models, right, of language allocation. Some days you might have, some teachers might have 1 day and 1 day of the arrangement. And so in the picture that you see right now, you see English, 1 day for English, 1 day for Spanish, and then every day. There are other models of allocation in which you have, it will be a week and a week. And other models that are the roller coaster that you might have, as in this example, the morning in one language and the afternoon in another, and the following day you continue with the different languages. So this is what you would see in most language dual language bilingual education programs. And what you also see is the strict separation. It's very common right now to go to schools and hear the message is like, during the English day, you only do English. During the Spanish day, you only do Spanish. And back in 2007, Jim Cummins already was talking about this idea of the two solitudes and the challenges of this strict language separation. Because what we are asking students to do or to be is to be two monolinguals in one, to really only during one of the spaces, the English space, that they only speak English, and then when they are in the other space, only speak the other language. And assuming that we can do that from the get-go, acting in a way or behaving in one way. And that's very challenging because what we want is bilingualism by literacy, and we want the development, and we want to really show how bilinguals communicate. And this strict separation, we do it sometimes, yes, of course. In this case, I'm doing this webinar in English, but I'm a bilingual person or a trilingual person. So the challenges we hear a lot from teachers, and we have seen it a lot, is that when you are in this language learning separate spaces, these are spaces that are socially, or the languages, this idea of English or Spanish, are social and politically defined. So these are really like this nation-state ideas of languages. Students cannot use all their full linguistic resources, and their languages are these ideas that we used for learning. The other challenge is that teachers cannot assess what students really can do because they are constrained in terms of only the language of the day or only the language of the morning or the lesson. So how can they say, these teachers see the true performance of the students? And very importantly, too, is that the students' bilingual languaging of their communities, what happens when we go and communicate with other bilingual people, they are not acknowledged and legitimized in instruction. So the messages that the students receive is that Only a true bilingual person is the one that can act monolingually. And then what happened with all of our practices that are more hybrid practices, which is the normal communicative practices of bilingual people. So this is why the idea of translanguaging is very important in dual language education. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an explanation of what translanguaging is, and I'm not going to go into much details because there's so much out there on this idea, but just to understand why translanguaging is very important in dual language education, and also this idea that is not used. A few teachers or some teachers are using it, usually behind closed doors. So what happens is that when we talk about this idea of translanguaging, we're really focusing on bilingualism from the perspective of the bilingual person, not from the perspective of this language as a nation state, like the Spanish with all their grammar rules, or the English, or whatever language that has been constructed. So we're talking about from the bilinguals' perspectives. And so what this idea of the bilingual people are not two monolingual people in one. And then when we communicate and we make sense of the world, bilingual people, and I use this idea of bilingual, but it's multilingual people with translanguage. And a definition of translanguaging that I'm getting from Otegi Garcia and Reed from a 2015 article is that translanguaging is when bilingual people use their own linguistic repertoire without regard for social and politically defined languages, labels, or boundaries. This idea of English or Spanish with all these rules. So translanguaging, we bilingual, multilingual people have one linguistic repertoire, and then we decide to use features from all our repertoire that might correspond to this English or might correspond to this French or Chinese, but this is our own language. So this definition of translanguaging is the fluid language practices of the speakers, labeled bilingual and multilingual. So this is what really bilinguals are. When we communicate, we are not thinking about one or the other, these named languages. When we communicate and when we learn, we use all what we have. And in some moments, we repress features so that we can sound more of like a monolingual. But we are repressing some of the features. And why is this very important in dual language bilingual education? Because we forget about those things. So what we are presenting in this webinar, and also you will see it with Gladys, is this idea of translanguaging and dual language bilingual education. We are, in addition of students deploying only features that have been approved for the school for the English or the Spanish time, and this is what mostly you see only in dual language bilingual programs or dual language programs. Teachers also plan for spaces in which students are allowed to deploy any of the features in their language repertoire to show what they know and what they can do and make sense of the learning. So the idea of we still have these spaces for English and for, or what society call English and what society call the language other than English, but also teachers plan for spaces in which this translanguaging happens for learning and communication. And these are the spaces in which teachers plan that a lot of teachers doing it. So it also legitimizes many teachers, what many teachers are already doing. So now I'm going to show visually, or how this translanguaging works in dual language bilingual education. So part of the research that we have done and the work that we have done, we talk about translanguaging for documenting students' holistic performance. We talk about translanguaging for scaffolding their named language learning, the English or the language other than English. And we talk about translanguaging for experiencing and understanding the communicative practices of bilingual. And I'm going to show you this visual representation so you can see how it works in this idea of the English day and the Spanish day, or the English week and the Spanish week. So we start with, you have the two spaces. So when we talk about translanguage and dual language bilingual education, you do have to have your English space and a Spanish space or whatever other language. And I use Spanish because Gladys teaches in a dual language bilingual Spanish-English program. So we have those spaces, whatever way you do it, by week, by day, roller coaster, doesn't matter. But then before we start a junior lesson, we have a space for translanguage documentation, to document what students know and are able to do. And also we do that through all the lessons. Then we identify some needs. Some students in one space might need to have much more connections with their other language. So we will create these spaces and what we call the translanguaging rings. And use the same thing in the Spanish version. In the Spanish time, you might have other students and you will know when they're English, they will need the English. And we also have these spaces for transformation, which is our separate spaces. And this is the example that you saw from Gladys. And so what you're seeing visually now is something that we have come up with Ofelia Garcia, Christian Solorza, and a team of teachers and other people from CUNY-NYSIEB to understand how to bring translanguaging into dual language. Now Gladys is going to talk about the two parts, the translanguaging rings and the documentation, and then we're going to do some questions and answers, and then the second part, we're going to talk about translanguaging transformation.
So as Maite mentioned, there are several things out there that her, Solorza, and Ofelia have written about, and that mention the rings and talk a little bit more about the documentation space that Maite just mentioned. The webinar that's available on the CUNY-NYSIEB website is one resource that you may want to refer to. So before I even give you examples of these spaces and the rings, I want to give you an idea of what my classroom composition is like and the demographics. So I teach 4th grade dual language in Queens, and the class is composed of 28 4th graders. Most of them were born in the United States. They speak Spanish at home for the most part. Some speak only Spanish, mostly Spanish at home, even though they're all exposed to English now. And many have been in the dual language program since kindergarten. Most of them have, except for a couple of newcomers. So most of my students come from Mexico and Ecuador. Either they were born there or their families are their first generation students born here. However, some students immigrated to the United States. The most recent was about 2 years ago. Some speak only English at home. I have white American students, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Peruvian, and Colombian families, and I'm Dominican. I do want to emphasize that we do advocate the separate spaces for each of the named languages. So there is a designated English space and a designated Spanish space. As you can see in my classroom, we alternate in our school program alternates by days. However, there's no strict language separation. So students know that they each have a translanguaging ring and that there are times when we need to translanguage in order to learn best. So as you can see, in both the blue English spaces and the red Spanish spaces, there are translanguaging lifesaver rings every single day. And then we have the documentation and transformation spaces. Now, I want to give you a little bit of a background of what these are because the rest of the webinar focuses mostly on the transformation spaces. However, I want to briefly give you an overview of what the rings are. So the translanguaging lifesaver rings we can refer to as an individual's language repertoire. It's basically the ring, an invisible ring that we all have around us, the way we think, the way we language, the way we interpret things, the way we speak, or which named language we use to speak and interpret specific things. And that depends on many things, right? So the goal in the classroom is for students to make sure that their rings are visible. So other people need to know, especially the teacher, what their language repertoire entails and what it is composed of. Then that way students are able to advocate for their rings and they can advocate and make choices about what they need and let the teacher decide what supports they can give her. Students should also be able and learn to contribute to each other's rings. And students in classrooms, you want to build a community where students strive to develop their rings. So everyone, including the teacher, is aiming to develop the named languages. In my classroom, it's English and Spanish. So here's an example of Sydney's ring, and this is what Sydney's ring may look like in the Spanish space. So on a Spanish day, Sydney knows that the focus is to learn in Spanish, to develop her Spanish language, and she knows that in order to do this, she needs to be aware of her ring and she needs to advocate and use a variety of resources. And so as you can see here, to the left-hand side, Sydney records keywords in her personal bilingual dictionary, and she has an end product in mind. So we always tell students what the goal of the social studies or science or reading lesson unit is. And they have in mind what words they need to document and record for themselves to learn. So in this case, she knew the word brick, but she had to write down ladrillo so she could remember that and perhaps use it in her comparative essay at the end of the unit. She also wrote down birch bark, corteza de abedul, which may have been a new vocabulary word for her in both languages, a new content word. Sydney relies mostly on the Spanish word wall, which you see up top. And then going clockwise, you can see that Sydney brainstorms mostly in English. So this is what she needs to do in order to get her ideas down, because it's her natural way of getting her ideas out and jotting them down on paper, or perhaps turning and talking and brainstorming that way. Sydney has a new best friend this year. Her name is Angelica, and she speaks to her new best friend mostly in Spanish because Angelica is a student who recently immigrated from Mexico about 2 years ago. Sydney knows that sometimes she can refer to the English math book to interpret word problems that are too sophisticated for her, or too difficult, or too complex. So she is able to open up that book when necessary. Now let's zoom into Angelica's ring on an English day. So here she is in this English space. And I'm not going to focus too much on this because, as we said, it's in the webinar. And because of the interest of time, I'll show you here. You can see she knew the word cazar, but she had to document hunt. So her ring, her personal bilingual dictionary looks different because she knows what she needs to add to her personal language repertoire. She depends mostly on the English word wall, and she's drafting mostly in Spanish at this point. Now, just to talk a little bit about the documentation space, and again, this is in the webinar, so I'm going to go through this quickly. In order for us to document what students need, we need to be able to observe those rings. And if they're suppressing a language during a specific space, then we won't be able to do that. So here we wouldn't be able to see what Sydney's bringing into this new unit. And we wouldn't have notes this elaborate, which we see here. So in order for me to decide what support students need and what I can contribute to their rings, and for me to plan these transformational spaces that I'm going to show you soon and that you saw in the video, I need to have those flexible spaces and I need to document.
We got some questions, so a couple of them are theoretical, and then we have a few that are more practical. Let's start with the theoretical question. Luis asked, in her book, Dr. Sonia Soltero writes that while the concept embedded in translanguaging are relevant to dual language education, the idea of fluid language boundaries can be incompatible with its programmatic functions. She argues for a separation of languages. I was wondering your thoughts about this tension related to programmatic impact as it relates to language allocation and translanguaging. This is a great question, and something that we hear all the time from administrators and some researchers from dual language education, right? So originally, and this is not a history lesson, but originally the focus of bilingual education was a civil rights issue for minoritized communities. So really the focus was more on the children and how they can learn the language of power, and also they're using their own languages. Eventually things have changed, and there has been much more focus on the language per se, really learning these languages, and this is the idea of these named languages. So we are forgetting the children, and we're forgetting because we're creating these models that are like strict separation throughout the years. We are forgetting the children and how children learn. And we'll learn from connections. And languaging, our own languages, are also how we connect the languages. So what we see, and I'm going to show the model at the end, but we are working, Garcia Solers and I are working in a publication, and you have some parts of it here in this webinar of this model of, so there has to be a language allocation for translanguaging as well. So right now the language allocation is a strict separation, and it doesn't count where students are coming from. So with this model that I show you, I'm going to show you at the end, you really focus on the two languages as the named languages, the two separate spaces. So you still want bilingualism and biliteracy. You still have the goal of writing in English. However, the process, right, we have some rings around some children, those who need it. in the English space or the Spanish space who might be different children. So you see what the students need and how they can bring their own home practices and their entire linguistic repertoire for learning. And then eventually, what do you need to do to get into the named language and the learning? The process, right? With the draft, why do the drafts have to be always only in the language of instruction if the idea of the draft is you get all your ideas, your structure, and then to get into a final product? So we, with this language allocation policy, the translanguaging allocation policy, we are focusing on the separation, but we're also focusing on this special in moments in which you have to connect and the students need to connect. But also with these named languages, we also have to think about what message are we giving? What are the languages? Are these the best languages? Is this the perfect Spanish or the perfect English? And we also have to question those things because usually with this strict separation, the language practices of our own communities are not legitimized.
I agree, Maite, and I see a question coming in that connects to that. How can we apply the lifesaver rings with first and second graders? I think it's important to be authentic with the students and let them know that you're giving them these scaffolds, but why are you giving them certain scaffolds so that they understand that some students may need more support in specific language structures, let's say in English. However, the other student uses it often at home. So, as opposed to me, eventually you want to wean them off of that. So instead of the student always depending on you for support, you want to start letting them make decisions and advocate and say, Maria's good with that, or I know she's strong with that language aspect. So I'm going to look at other rings, and which is why I say kids need to be aware of each other's linguistic rings, and they need to make it visible, because then I know that I can go to Maria, who has a very visible ring now that we know each other, and I can get that support as opposed to always depending on the teacher. Or I can go look at the bilingual dictionary, etc. So I think it's a matter in first and second grade. With the little ones, it is more on the teacher side, but just explaining really so they're not dependent on you.
So we have a couple more questions that are more instructional. So we're going to go through more examples of instruction from Gladys' classroom, and then we can get to those questions and probably other ones. So remember, we are saying they have to be separate spaces. So we are not saying that the separation cannot happen. They have to have spaces for English and Spanish, whatever model you're following, the week or the day or the roller coaster. If it's 2 teachers or 1 teacher or by subject, whatever it is, you follow that. However, you need to document to see what the student full linguistic repertoire before a unit and also during, you also documenting. And you also have to look at what individual students need and how they can use each other for resources. And that's how the translanguaging rings.
Right. So one of the questions was, how often do you implement the spaces? And there's no answer for that. And every year varies, and it varies week by week and student year by year, depending on the class. It depends on what you're documenting and what you're noticing that the whole class needs. And usually transformational spaces are because everyone has a misconception, like we said, in society, and things you want to clarify, or connections, metalinguistic connections that you want them to make.
So now we're going to focus on this other idea of the translanguaging transformation space. So these are spaces that are not during the English day or the Spanish day. So this is new spaces. And most people don't do it in dual language classrooms. Gladys does it in her classroom. And so here, remember, this is part of the model of this language allocation model. So in addition to have the separate spaces for English and Spanish and the translanguaging rings within this, we also create sometimes, and we will see when, some spaces in which we give students the opportunity to work within an instructional space where their fluid language practices are made visible, where their normal way of communicating is made visible. And we call this the transformation spaces, because it's really a transformation in terms of what we bilingual people do when we communicate with our other bilingual people, but usually schooling, it's not permitted, that type of communication, right? So when do we do that? We can do it as a standalone section of a unit or an official translanguaging space. And that's the example that you saw from Gladys, was in a standalone section of a unit. or you can do it within your English or your load space when you're doing in small groups or full class activity, when you want to do this meta-linguistic awareness exercises on vocabulary, building vocabulary. So you could do it as a standalone or within an English space, but more for transformation, really the connection of the very, very clear connection of the languages. And so now Gladys is going to go in more detail of how she does it, and she's going to provide 2 examples of how she does this translanguaging transformation space. One is the video lesson that you watch. She's going to walk over you through the lesson and provide some student information. And then she's going to talk about another lesson that she did to deduce the meaning of sophisticated words in English using Spanish.
So if you were able to see the video, and I hope that you were, then you got a chance to read the content objective, language objective, and translanguaging objective. Basically, the gist was for students to really justify the author's translanguaging moves or their word choices, which is an important Common Core standard in 4th grade and in several of the upper grades. So the goal here was to create a list of reasons that authors choose to translanguage. And if you saw on the webpage, in this picture here, you can see that was the beginning of us brainstorming in this list. So in order for us to do this, we have to use our entire linguistic repertoire. In order for us to compare what a word would sound like in the opposite language and how the effect it has in the opposite language is different, we need to obviously think in both languages and compare them. So this is an example of transformation translanguaging space. The purpose here, well, there were several purposes, but basically the most important purpose here is for students to strengthen their own writing craft and to be more mindful when translanguaging. We were beginning a unit in poetry, as I mentioned in the video, and I wanted students to have a tangible list of reasons that authors translanguage, especially for poems which we would be writing in sensitive topics that are intrinsically tied to language, such as bilingualism, multiculturalism, and immigration. So before I delve into the lesson, I'll give you a little background of our preparation. The days before the activity, I asked the students, again, we wanted them to contribute to this, I asked them if they wanted to help me brainstorm a list of reasons authors choose to translanguage, which would then become an anchor chart for our next unit, which is writing poetry. So the students and I revisited a variety of texts that we had already read during the school year, and we revisited some of their own biographies and essays and other pieces of writing that they had published. And finally, before this lesson, we had a conversation about, we're going to do this tomorrow. It's, I don't know if it was English or Spanish, but should this be in English or in Spanish, on an English or Spanish day? And we all agreed that it has to be a translanguaging lesson. So those type of conversations are critical in the classroom. So during the activity, as you can see here, the students returned to the marked pages and they analyzed those translanguaging word choices. So you can see here that in the biography that Stephen wrote, he wrote that I have a dream, gritó, Martin Luther King. So his translanguaging there was, as you can see in the bottom, because son frases importantes que no tienen traducción. They're important phrases or expressions that have no translation. There are other examples here, which you can see. Ginger ale, Starburst, and banana split are all the names of food, so how can we possibly translate that? And Girl Scout is part of the American culture. Other examples that you can see here to the bottom left in Gracias de Thanksgiving Turkey. There's a lot of translanguaging there. So, ¿qué problema? When Tia Rosa screamed, ¿qué problema? That brother of mine is loco. It's very funny, and the kids say, oh yeah, it wouldn't sound as funny if she didn't translanguage. Another reason that they saw here was when the police officer in New York City said, hi, Clarine, because she doesn't speak Spanish. So it shows what language they speak. So these are all the reasons that we brainstormed. And this list kept growing as we continued. It didn't stop this day because as we read in both languages and encounter different texts, we come upon many different reasons that the author could have translanguaged. And then we also came to realize that maybe the author didn't deliberately translanguage for one specific reason, but it also has that effect. So it also strengthened the students' writing in that sense. So what is the importance of this transformation space? This space validates students' languaging. A lot of these students are already doing this, and the fact that they see famous authors, Julia Alvarez, and all these authors that they're reading on a daily basis, and perhaps they notice the translanguaging, but they don't think much of it. So this lesson really put a value to that and to what they are already doing, so that they see, oh, these people don't suppress part of their language or, repress their English on the Spanish space and vice versa. So this is very powerful in that sense. Metalinguistics competence is also strengthened through lessons like these, and it helps them advocate for their own languaging. So when they have to defend themselves to an old school principle, let's say, they're able to articulate their reasoning. And of course, it inspires transformation and innovation. So students know most authors, even if they are multilingual, or even if they're catering to multilingual audiences, they stick to one language. So they know that they are now innovators, and that they have very few mentor texts. Now we have more and more, but traditionally this isn't something that's done. So it really does inspire transformation in the classroom. So here's another example of a transformation space that I've implemented. I taught earlier this year. This activity pushed students to use their Spanish to deduce the meaning of sophisticated English words. Sophisticated English words are words that we use often in our classroom, and I realized that not all students were translanguaging to figure them out, so this is why I decided to implement this activity. So the purpose here was to strengthen their abilities to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words or cognates. For example, if we look to the right-hand side, the blue words, all these sophisticated words, culpable, annotate, vigilant, obedient, remedy. And these are words that we can determine without a context or anything, because it's very similar to their cognates in Spanish, which students hear by the time they're born, and at home they're exposed to these very simple everyday words. So culpable, anotar, vigilar, obediente, y remedio, right? So the purpose of this lesson was to figure that out. Here's some example of these, what we call sophisticated words, words that principals, lawyers, college professors, and doctors use all the time. And in my classroom, I make an effort to use these authentically, and students are praised when they use them authentically, like he deliberately pushed me during recess, or we can simultaneously eat breakfast in the classroom and read our book, right? So our goal now is to be able to determine the meaning of sophisticated, our goal now is to determine the meaning of sophisticated English words and use our Spanish. Now, this is an anchor chart that I want to give you a background of before I present the activity, because it's very important. From September, I remind students that these are 4 strategies that we can use in the classroom to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words. Context clues, of course, word parts, the word function, and this is a translanguaging quadrant where I remind students that words in English can help you figure out words in Spanish, and vice versa. So we cannot forget that. Now, it's very important to know that we need to use all of these simultaneously. And often students use one of these strategies. However, they forget to translanguage, or they forget to use the context clues. And so it takes a lot of practice. So here's the structure of this lesson and how I encourage students to be more mindful of translanguaging when determining the meaning of sophisticated unknown words. So there were 3 parts. The first part was documentation. This documentation space was two-part pre-assessment, and I will show you that in a minute. Then I did the mini lesson for the students that needed it. And then in part 3, students translanguage to revise their part 2. So the students that were part of the mini lesson were able to go back and apply this translanguaging as a strategy. So in the pre-assessment, as you can see, students, of course, this chart is always up. So students were given part 1 only. What do you think these words mean? I told them to define the words that they know or that they think they know. Some were left blank. And that allowed me to document which students knew some words already, or perhaps were translanguaging or guessing words based on the cognate. Then I collected that and I gave them part 2, and I say, okay, now try to figure these out. Same words, but now here I was able to document which students are using the top left quadrant, the context clue strategy, to figure out unfamiliar words. So let's analyze Jackie's work. Jackie is aware of her linguistic repertoire. Spanish comes easier for her, and she tends to interpret things in Spanish. She's confident of using her entire linguistic repertoire, and you can see that here. For matrimony, the context I gave was their matrimony was 25 years ago. We celebrated their 25th anniversary. So she said it was when you get married or te casas. So there's her naturally translanguaging. For suave, he's a suave salesman who always convinces people to buy expensive cars. She wrote someone who is making things suave. So for Jackie, this was transformational because she's able to validate the fact that translanguaging was helpful, and later on you'll see that she was able to share it and help students like Juan understand that they should translanguage. So here's Juan. Juan speaks mostly Spanish at home. However, he separated his two named languages. So we can see he saw a sentence in English and he was trying in English, and he used the context because there was a solitary bird in the sky. He said, oh, someone's very high. So he kind of used the context there. However, solo and solitario would have really helped him understand that this bird was by himself. Students like Juan really needed this mini lesson. So what I did was I implemented this mini lesson with those students depending on what I was able to document for the pre-assessment. And in this mini lesson, I referred to the chart and the translanguaging quadrant and reminded them that, you know, they did a great job guessing and figuring it out using the contexts, but some of them forgot to translanguage. So I modeled with a custom, an acostumbrado, and of course, all these aha moments. Ah, yes, of course, I use that word all the time, acostumbrado. I've been using it as a baby. So I modeled how I went back to my, to the worksheet and used a red pen to write the Spanish word that reminded me of that sophisticated English word. So in this case, next to accustomed, I wrote acostumbrado in red. And with the green pen, I would revise my prior definition. So I can see my own growth and show the teacher or whoever is looking at my worksheet how I translanguage. So this was very empowering for Jackie, because if you see in the bottom for edifice, Jackie said Manhattan has so many gigantic edifices. And you can see the green check. She confirmed she didn't have to revise with her green. She just checked it. And she had already guessed buildings. And now she was able to tell us what word she had naturally used to determine the meaning of edifice, which she said she had never heard before. So I had her come up to the Elmo, to the camera, and model for us. That was very empowering for her, and it really validated what she does naturally. Because she knows, she's aware of her translanguaging ring, and that's her life-saving strategy, she has to use her Spanish to figure things out. And here she did it, and it was validated. And she got to show it to the whole class. So now the students that received the lesson and students who didn't receive the lesson, they got to go back, because now everybody wanted to use the red pens to see what word reminded them of the new sophisticated English word. And they were able to show their translanguaging and their revisions with green and red pens. So I'll show you some examples of several students that I had who really benefited from this mini lesson. Students like Juan needed this reminder to translanguage. These two students, for example, this one student for cerebral had initially wrote what you can see in the pencil. Being bilingual and translanguaging is good speaking exercise. So, which makes sense. So this tells me as a teacher in documenting that, okay, this student is using the context very well. However, he is not translanguaging. After the mini lesson, you can see that he revised his definition to brain. So it's good brain exercise, which is something I say in the class all the time. And the Spanish word that helped him was cerebro. Another example is this student who had originally written in pencil, it's good being bilingual. So being bilingual in translanguage is good cerebral exercise. It's good being bilingual. So he kind of had the idea that it's good, but he didn't use cerebro to help him. Then when he revised it, he wrote the definition in both languages. So it's a good exercise for the brain. And the Spanish context, the Spanish everyday word that helped him was cerebro. Es un buen ejercicio para el cerebro. This transformation space is also very important for similar reasons. So again, it sharpens their metalinguistic competence. They're able to articulate their languages, their languaging strategies. And now Jackie's happy to share every time she determines the meaning of a new word, she's happy to share what Spanish word can help us. Although most students are now doing this more and more, and they're not forgetting to translanguage. Now, something I should mention is, again, that it's important to use all 4 quadrants, so we have to remember you can't just translanguage and think, for example, for false cognates that embarazado is embarrassed without using the context. So very important. Of course, it's important because it values the linguistic resources that each student has. So Jackie's Spanish, for example, is valued here. And students appreciate the diversity in the classroom because now Jackie made her translanguaging ring more explicit and more visible, and students know, like, oh, I can go to her for certain topics in certain areas when I want to strengthen my own linguistic ring and add to it. So some final words before we get to the questions, and we're doing good on time, great. I know it's hard because translanguaging is a new concept, or better yet, it's breaking the norms of what's out there and what's been thought for so many years to really strictly separate the bilingual person's languages, named languages. I think it's important my advice is that it's important to model inquiry and metalinguistic awareness. So every day I'm, thinking out loud and modeling and wondering about words and why one thing is in Spanish, one thing is in English, and I wonder this and that. And we Google together and we translanguage together and we talk about why we're reflecting on these things. It's also important to make authenticity and reflection your classroom norms. As I mentioned before, you have to be authentic. It's like having conversations with your friends sometimes because otherwise students don't build that independence and their self-awareness of their linguistic spaces. And then that translanguaging ring is never visible. It's important to teach students, teach the children, teach the students, do not teach the curriculum. So it's hard with a lot of the curricula that's out there now to cater it to students with different, to really pay attention to the rings if you are to focus on the curriculum. So I think it's critical to really teach your students to make their rings explicit, observe the rings and document, and then start small and then be transformative.
And just a reminder, so through this webinar, the past 45 or 50 minutes, you have seen this model with some examples. So as a reminder, I'm going to go over this model again. There is an English space and a load space. And before a lesson and during the lesson, you document where the student is in their entire linguistic repertoire. So then you can identify what individual students need to learn that name language English or the name language Spanish, for example. But then in some moments, you will have this translanguaging transformation spaces in which you want the students to be able to make those metacognitive awareness moments and be bilingual themselves and read bilingual authors. So in this, when we talk about a model of translanguaging in dual language education, it's a very thoughtful process. It's not that anything happens at any time. There's this information, there's a publication that will come with more examples from practice in our CUNY-NYSIEB webpage at some point this early in the summer. There are other things if you want to continue learning more about translanguaging. Of course, most of you know there's a lot of things in our webpage. And there's a few new publications on translanguaging with multilingual students. This publication is edited by Ofelia Garcia and Tatiana Klein. So now we have a few more minutes for questions and answers. And I have been receiving some of the questions. And I have a couple of then more theoretical again for me, and then more practical for Gladys. Remember that this idea of the theoretical perspective, we have been learning with teachers, like with Gladys, and we have many other teachers that we have been working very closely. So it's not that we are coming up with these ideas when we go to sleep, right? So we have Maria asking, we have a side-by-side model, different classrooms, different teachers, which is why we completely separate the languages, right? The other teacher is not bilingual. So it is it I, the one who just do translanguaging in my classroom? And if I do that, wouldn't I be decreasing Spanish time, making the allocation less than 50%? So that's a very important question because Gladys' example, right, it's a self-contained bilingual teacher, right? So she's bilingual, the kids are bilingual. But this model of translanguaging also works with teachers that are monolingual. You don't have to plan for translanguaging if you are bilingual only. Good side-by-side models of bilingual education, the planning is very important. So even if you as a teacher, you are monolingual, you need to plan with your partner and plan for those documentations. Get the information from the other teacher of what the student can do in the other named language. You can learn some strategies for turn and talk in your classroom. The kids are their own resources. You don't have to have all the control. And then maybe as a teachers, you can come together to plan for these transformation spaces together or in some moments, because good side-by-side models require a lot of planning. And planning for translanguaging should be one element in that planning.
Right, I agree. And if you're having this translanguaging space, you agree that both classes need it simultaneously, then the next day you come back and say, oh, you made this connection in the other language, in the other room, and now we're going to build on that. I think it's important. Part of this side-by-side marriage is to know all of your students and to use all of their languaging and their linguistic repertoire to help them learn when they're in your classroom.
We have 1 more minute, so probably time for one more question. Gladys, there's a couple of questions about the examples, so if you want to go over.
Should translanguaging moments or spaces happen before, during, after unit? I think it should happen always. So as I mentioned before, it's important for it to happen before, because that's when you know how to set up the unit. What scaffolds will you need? As you know, curriculums are different every year, depending on the students you have. So what language supports will you need to implement, and what transformation spaces do you need to have as well in the beginning of the unit? As you go along, students will be able to know what they need to, like we saw the personal bilingual dictionary, how can they meet the unit's end goal? And at the end, if you're presenting to a bilingual, multilingual audience, then you're translanguaging at the end for your presentation. So these are just some short examples. I'd like to remind you to go to the website, because there are resources there and some newer ones coming out that show how Christian Solorza and a CUNY-NYSIEB team, including myself, how we embed these translanguaging spaces deliberately throughout a unit. I gave the example of my 4th grade social studies unit. In order for students to have a Spanish sophisticated essay at the end of the 5 weeks.
And also, just to finish, there was a webinar archive as well that talks about all these examples that Gladys was mentioning. So there are a lot of resources that you can learn more about translanguaging in dual language education. As a teacher, try it. You will see with your kids. You will see the difference if you allow for a little bit more flexibility, still thinking about the spaces separated and the communication and with teachers and with the students. So with this, we want to say thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias.